It wasn't just another American fighter. It was the weapon that would destroy Japanese naval aviation forever. On June 19, 1944, when those dark blue Hellcats dove through our formations with devastating precision, every Japanese pilot in the sky knew the age of the Zero was over. The F6F Hellcat didn't just outclass the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. It hunted it with methodical efficiency. 650 caliber Browning machine guns that converged at the perfect killing range. Armor plating that made it virtually indestructible. And that massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, 2,000 horsepower, that could push the Hellcat to 380 miles per hour and climb at over 2,500 feet per minute. What happened that day over the Philippine Sea wasn't a battle. It was an execution. In what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 480 aircraft, while the Americans lost just 33 planes. This is the true story of how the F6F Hellcat became the most successful fighter aircraft in naval history, achieving an unprecedented kill ratio of 19-1, and how it crushed the once invincible Zero in the most decisive carrier battle ever fought. My name is Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, and I was there when American naval aviation reached its zenith. I commanded Air Group 15 from USS Essex, and on that single day in June, I personally shot down 7 Japanese aircraft. Before the war ended, I would claim 34 victories, every single one while flying the Hellcat. People ask me what made the F6F so dominant. The answer isn't simple, but it starts with understanding that the Hellcat was designed from the beginning to do one thing perfectly: kill Zeros. The Zero had terrorized American pilots since Pearl Harbor. Lightweight, maneuverable, with exceptional range, it seemed invincible in the early war years. Brewster Buffaloes were slaughtered. Our Wildcats could barely compete. Pilots were dying because they flew inferior aircraft against a superior enemy. The Navy knew we needed something better, something that could take everything the Japanese threw at us and hit back twice as hard. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had been building carrier fighters since the 1930s. Their F4F Wildcat had kept us in the fight during the darkest days, but everyone knew it was outmatched by the Zero. When the Navy asked for a new carrier fighter in early 1942, Grumman's design team already knew what pilots needed. They'd listened to combat reports from Midway, the Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal. They knew the Wildcat's weaknesses and the Zero's strengths. What they created was revolutionary. The Hellcat abandoned the lightweight fighter philosophy that dominated pre-war thinking. Instead of trying to outturn the Zero, it would outpower it. Instead of sacrificing protection for maneuverability, it would keep pilots alive to fight another day. Instead of elegant aerodynamics, it prioritized rugged construction and overwhelming firepower. The result was an aircraft that weighed nearly twice as much as a Zero, but could still outclimb it, outdive it, and absolutely demolish it in a head-on pass. The Hellcat's 6 guns fired 400 rounds per gun, and when all 6 converged at 300 yards, nothing could survive the concentrated firepower. On June 19, 1944, over the Philippine Sea, the F6F Hellcat proved beyond any doubt that it was the most lethal carrier fighter ever built. Japanese pilots, who dominated Pacific skies for years, were shot down like beginners. Their legendary Zero had met its master, and the slaughter was absolute. The Pacific War began disastrously for American naval aviation. At Pearl Harbor, on December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft destroyed most of our Pacific fleet while suffering minimal losses. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters swept aside our defenses with ease. In the Philippines, our handful of fighters were overwhelmed. At Wake Island, a small group of Wildcats fought bravely, but were eventually annihilated. The Zero seemed unstoppable. With a maximum speed of 330 miles per hour, exceptional maneuverability, and a range of over 1,500 miles, it outperformed every Allied fighter in the Pacific. Japanese pilots, trained for years in aggressive tactics, used the Zero's advantages ruthlessly. American pilots learned quickly that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide. The F4F Wildcat, our primary carrier fighter in early 1942, was tough and reliable, but clearly inferior to the Zero. It was slower, climbed worse. Wildcat pilots developed tactics to compensate, using diving attacks and refusing to engage in turning fights. But they were always at a disadvantage. We were losing pilots we couldn't afford to lose. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 and Midway in June showed that American pilots could win despite inferior aircraft. At Midway, we lost 29 out of 41 torpedo bombers in a single attack wave. Fighter escorts couldn't protect them adequately. The Wildcat simply couldn't do everything we needed. Admiral John Towers, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, understood that better aircraft were essential for victory. He'd been pushing manufacturers to develop improved fighters since before Pearl Harbor, but most designs were still on drawing boards when war started. The Navy needed something that could enter production quickly and defeat the Zero decisively. Grumman's design team, led by Chief Engineer William Schwendler and Project Engineer Dick Hutton, had been working on the F6F concept since mid-1941. They'd incorporated lessons from the European Air War, where heavily armed and armored fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt were proving that survivability mattered more than pure agility. When the Navy provided combat reports from the Pacific, Grumman refined the design specifically to counter the Zero. The key insight was understanding that carrier fighters needed different capabilities than land-based aircraft. They needed to be tough enough to survive combat damage and still land on a carrier. They needed firepower to destroy enemies quickly before they could damage American ships. They needed range for fleet defense. And critically, they needed to be easy to fly, so replacement pilots with less training could be effective. The F6F design prioritized all these factors. The massive R2800 engine provided power for speed, climb, and durability. Armor plating protected the pilot, oil cooler, and fuel tanks. Self-sealing fuel tanks could absorb multiple hits without catching fire. The landing gear was enormously strong to handle hard carrier landings. The cockpit was designed for good visibility and intuitive controls. When the prototype flew for the first time on June 26, 1942, test pilots immediately recognized they had something special. The Hellcat was fast, stable, and forgiving. It felt solid and powerful. Most importantly, it could do everything the Wildcat couldn't: climb rapidly, dive without compressibility problems, and absorb battle damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. The Navy ordered the F6F into production immediately, even before flight testing was complete. We were desperate for a fighter that could beat the Zero, and the Hellcat showed enormous promise. Grumman began building a massive new factory in Bethpage, New York, designed specifically for F6F production. By January 1943, the first production Hellcats were rolling off the assembly line. By summer, they were reaching carrier squadrons in the Pacific. American pilots who'd been fighting with one hand tied behind their backs were about to receive the weapon they needed. The Japanese had no idea what was coming. They'd grown confident in the Zero's superiority and believed American fighters would never match their agile, lightweight design. That confidence would prove fatal. I first saw an F6F Hellcat in April 1943 at Naval Air Station Norfolk. Air Group 15 was transitioning from Wildcats to the new fighter, and the first 6 Hellcats had just arrived from Grumman's factory. They sat on the flight line like dark blue monsters, bigger and more aggressive-looking than anything I'd flown before. The specifications seemed too good to be true. Empty weight: 9,238 pounds, nearly twice the weight of a Zero. Maximum speed: 380 miles per hour at 17,300 feet. Service ceiling: 37,300 feet. Rate of climb: 2,590 feet per minute. Combat range: 1,040 miles with drop tank. But it was the armament that impressed most. 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. Total ammunition: 2,400 rounds. Rate of fire: 800 rounds per minute per gun. That meant a 2-second burst put 200 bullets into a concentrated killing zone at 300 yards convergence range. The R280010 double wasp engine was a masterpiece of engineering. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each producing massive power. With water injection for combat emergency power, the engine could generate 2,200 horsepower. The 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller was 13 feet diameter, perfectly matched to extract maximum performance from that enormous engine. The first time I climbed into the cockpit, I understood why test pilots were so enthusiastic. The seat was high with excellent visibility in all directions. The instrument panel was logical and well organized. The controls fell naturally to hand. Everything felt solid and substantial, completely different from the cramped, flimsy feel of earlier fighters. My first flight was a revelation. The Hellcat accelerated smoothly and powerfully, completely unlike the Wildcat's labored climb. I reached 10,000 feet in under 4 minutes. The controls were responsive but not twitchy. The aircraft stable and confidence-inspiring. I pushed into a steep dive, and the Hellcat accelerated without the buffeting or control problems that plagued some fighters. At 8,000 feet, I pulled into a climbing turn, and the engine responded instantly to throttle input. But the real test was firepower. At the gunnery range, we practiced on towed targets. When I squeezed the trigger and all 6 guns fired simultaneously, the noise was deafening and the aircraft shuddered from recoil. Tracers converged perfectly at 300 yards and the target disintegrated. The firepower was simply overwhelming. Nothing could survive a solid burst from 650s. The engineering details revealed how much thought went into pilot protection. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat and headrest could stop 20mm cannon shells. The oil cooler and oil tank had additional armor to prevent fires. The bulletproof windscreen was thick glass, laminated with plastic. The self-sealing fuel tanks were lined with rubber that swelled when punctured, automatically stopping leaks. The landing gear was engineered for carrier operations. Enormously strong main gear struts could absorb hard landings that would collapse lighter structures. The tailhook was robust and reliable. The wing folding mechanism was manual, but simple and foolproof. Everything about the Hellcat was designed for the brutal realities of carrier warfare. Commander Paul Bowie, who would later lead VF-16 to great success, described the Hellcat perfectly during our training. He said this aircraft is everything the Wildcat wasn't. It's fast enough to catch anything. It's tough enough to survive mistakes. It's powerful enough to climb away from trouble. And it's armed well enough to destroy anything in one pass. The Zero is lighter and more maneuverable. But in combat, that doesn't matter. We'll kill them before they know we're there. By July 1943, Air Group 15 was fully equipped with Hellcats and preparing to deploy aboard USS Essex. We'd practiced gunnery until we could hit targets consistently. We'd mastered carrier landings until we could trap aboard in any weather. We'd developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the Hellcat's strengths against the Zero's weaknesses. We were ready to take the war to the Japanese, and we had the perfect weapon to do it. When USS Essex sortied from Pearl Harbor on August 31, 1943, carrying Air Group 15 with its full complement of F6F Hellcats, the word spread through the fleet that the new fighters had finally arrived. Pilots who'd been fighting in Wildcats for 2 years wanted to know if the Hellcat was really as good as advertised. The skepticism was understandable. We'd heard promises before about wonder weapons that turned out to be disappointing. The answer came during our first combat operation on September 1st, during strikes against Marcus Island. The Japanese defenders launched several Zeros to intercept our attack. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Strain, flying his first combat mission in a Hellcat, encountered 2 Zeros at 15,000 feet. He later described the engagement in his mission report. He wrote that they tried to turn with him, but the Hellcat's power meant he could choose his terms of engagement. He dove on the first Zero from above and behind, closed to 200 yards, and fired a 2-second burst. The Zero exploded. The second Zero tried to escape by diving, but the Hellcat was faster. Another burst, and the second Zero went down trailing smoke. Both enemies destroyed without taking a single hit. That pattern repeated throughout the day. Hellcat pilots intercepted Japanese fighters, used superior speed and firepower to destroy them quickly, then escaped before enemy reinforcements could arrive. We lost no aircraft to enemy fighters. The Japanese lost 11. The kill ratio spoke for itself. Commander James Flatley, commanding VF-5 aboard USS Yorktown, had been flying Wildcats since before Pearl Harbor. He'd survived some of the war's most desperate battles, including Coral Sea and Midway, always fighting at a disadvantage. When his squadron received Hellcats in mid-1943, he couldn't believe the difference. He told his pilots that for the first time they could fight the Japanese on equal terms. He was wrong. They weren't equal terms. They were overwhelmingly in our favor. The Japanese reaction to the Hellcat was slower to develop because initially they didn't realize they were facing a new fighter. Early combat reports from Japanese pilots described encounters with improved Wildcats or new American types, but they didn't understand that the F6F represented a fundamental shift in capability. That changed during the Battle for the Gilbert Islands in November 1943. During strikes on Tarawa, Japanese naval air forces launched major counterattacks against Task Force 50. Dozens of Zeros escorted torpedo bombers and dive bombers in desperate attempts to damage American carriers. They encountered a solid wall of Hellcats directed by radar to perfect intercept positions. The slaughter was comprehensive. In 3 days of fighting, Hellcats destroyed over 100 Japanese aircraft while losing only 5 to enemy action. Japanese after-action reports captured later revealed their growing concern. Pilots reported the new American fighter was faster than the Zero, more heavily armed, and seemingly indestructible. Multiple Zeros would attack a single Hellcat, score hits that should have been fatal, and watch the American fighter simply absorb the damage and keep fighting. Meanwhile, a single burst from the Hellcat's 6 guns would destroy a Zero instantly. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. They'd been taught that Japanese warrior spirit and superior training would overcome any material disadvantage. But the Hellcat made that philosophy irrelevant. Superior spirit couldn't compensate for being shot down before you could even maneuver. Superior training meant nothing when the enemy could choose whether to engage or escape at will. American pilots, by contrast, gained confidence with every mission. They knew they flew the best carrier fighter in the world. They knew the Hellcat would bring them home even if damaged. They knew that in any encounter with a Zero, they had overwhelming advantages. That confidence translated into aggressive tactics and increasing success. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, received regular reports about Hellcat performance. In December 1943, he wrote to Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, that the F6F was proving to be the decisive weapon in establishing American air superiority. He requested accelerated production to equip all carrier squadrons as quickly as possible. By early 1944, the Hellcat had replaced the Wildcat as the Navy's primary carrier fighter. Every carrier air group included at least one, usually two or more, Hellcat squadrons. The Japanese Zero, which had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years, was now the hunted instead of the hunter. Everything about the F6F Hellcat contradicted Japanese fighter philosophy, and that fundamental difference determined who would win the Pacific Air War. The Japanese had built the Zero around specific beliefs about what made a superior fighter: lightweight for maneuverability, long range for operational flexibility, and minimal protection to save weight. Those beliefs had worked brilliantly in the war's early years, when American fighters were even less capable. The Zero's design philosophy came from Japan's limited industrial capacity. They couldn't build thousands of heavy, complex fighters like America could. Instead, they focused on making each aircraft as capable as possible within strict weight limits. The result was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering, a fighter that weighed just 4,130 pounds empty, yet could fly over 1,500 miles and outturn anything in the sky. But that lightweight design came with enormous trade-offs. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot. The fuel tanks weren't self-sealing, meaning a single incendiary bullet could turn the aircraft into a fireball. The airframe was so lightly built that high-speed maneuvers could cause structural failure. The guns were rifle-caliber weapons that required multiple hits to destroy enemy aircraft. In combat, against equally fragile opponents, these compromises were acceptable. Against the Hellcat, they were fatal. The F6F represented the opposite philosophy. American industrial capacity meant we could build heavy, complex fighters in massive quantities. The Hellcat's empty weight of 9,238 pounds was more than twice the Zero's weight, but that weight brought advantages the Japanese couldn't match. Armor protection meant pilots survived hits that would kill Zero pilots. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant battle damage didn't automatically result in catastrophic fires. Rugged construction meant the Hellcat could survive combat stress that would destroy lighter aircraft. The contradiction in offensive capability was equally stark. The Zero carried 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The 20mm were powerful but had limited ammunition, just 60 rounds per gun, and a slow rate of fire. Zero pilots had to get close and aim precisely to achieve kills. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns with 400 rounds each. American pilots could fire longer bursts from greater distance, and the sheer volume of fire compensated for less precision. The tactical contradiction became obvious in combat. Zero pilots relied on tight-turning dogfights, where their superior maneuverability gave them advantage. Hellcat pilots refused to dogfight, instead using diving attacks, high-speed passes, and overwhelming firepower. The Japanese kept trying to force turning engagements. The Americans simply wouldn't cooperate. And the Zero's maneuverability advantage meant nothing if they couldn't force an engagement on their terms. The training contradiction was perhaps most significant. Japanese pilots received extensive training before the war, often over 1,000 hours of flight time, including aerobatics, navigation, and gunnery. This created an elite force of superb pilots, but Japan couldn't replace losses. By 1944, most experienced pilots were dead, and replacements received minimal training, sometimes as little as 50 hours total flight time. American pilot training was shorter but more systematic. New pilots received 300 to 400 hours, including extensive gunnery practice, carrier qualification, and combat tactics. More importantly, America could sustain this training pipeline indefinitely. When experienced pilots were lost, well-trained replacements were available immediately. The F6F's forgiving handling characteristics meant these replacement pilots could be effective quickly. The industrial contradiction was most devastating. Japan built approximately 10,500 Zeros during the entire war. Grumman built over 12,000 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, with production peaking at 650 aircraft per month. America could lose Hellcats at a 3-to-1 ratio and still come out ahead numerically. Japan couldn't afford to lose Zeros at any ratio. The strategic contradiction was simple. Japanese fighter philosophy assumed limited resources, required maximum individual capability. American fighter philosophy assumed unlimited resources, enabled overwhelming collective capability. In a short war, the Japanese approach might have worked. In a long war of attrition, the American approach was unbeatable. The Hellcat proved that in modern warfare, protecting your pilots and overwhelming the enemy with superior technology mattered more than individual aircraft performance. The Zero's legendary maneuverability was irrelevant against an opponent who refused to maneuver, chose its combat terms, and killed with brutal efficiency. The age of the lightweight, nimble fighter was over. The age of the armored gunship had begun. After 6 months of Hellcat operations in the Pacific, the Bureau of Aeronautics conducted a comprehensive analysis of combat performance. The results confirmed what pilots already knew. The F6F was the most successful carrier fighter ever deployed. But the investigation revealed something more significant. The Hellcat was changing the fundamental nature of carrier warfare. The kill ratio statistics were extraordinary. Through March 1944, Hellcats had destroyed over 800 confirmed enemy aircraft, while losing only 42 to air-to-air combat. That 19-to-1 ratio exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war predictions. More importantly, the loss rate was so low that carrier air groups could sustain combat operations indefinitely without degrading effectiveness. The consequence was strategic. Before the Hellcat, carrier task forces had to withdraw periodically to replace combat losses and rest exhausted pilots. With the F6F, carriers could operate continuously for months. Task Force 58, built around Essex-class carriers equipped with Hellcats, conducted sustained operations from January through June 1944, without returning to Pearl Harbor for major refitting. The investigation identified several factors contributing to the Hellcat's dominance. First was the aircraft's durability. Combat damage reports showed Hellcats routinely returned to carriers with damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Bullet holes through wings and fuselage, damaged control surfaces, engine cylinders shot off, all were survivable in the Hellcat. One aircraft returned with over 200 bullet holes and landed safely. Second was the armament effectiveness. The 650 caliber guns produced devastating firepower that killed enemies quickly and reliably. Gunnery analysis showed Hellcat pilots needed an average of just 150 rounds, about 2 seconds of firing, to destroy an enemy fighter. The Zero's lighter armament required sustained bursts, and Japanese pilots rarely had time for multiple attacks against alert Hellcat pilots. Third was the radar-directed fighter direction system. Hellcats operated under guidance from carrier combat information centers equipped with advanced radar. Controllers vectored fighters to perfect intercept positions, eliminating the guesswork from finding enemy formations. Japanese pilots still relied on visual search and often never found their targets. When they did, Hellcats were already positioned for attack. The consequence for Japanese naval aviation was catastrophic. Monthly loss rates became unsustainable. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs couldn't produce adequate replacements because Japan lacked the fuel, aircraft, and time to train pilots properly. The quality of Japanese pilots declined precipitously through 1944. The investigation also examined Hellcat maintenance and reliability. Unlike some high-performance fighters that required extensive maintenance, the F6F was remarkably reliable. The R-2800 engine could run for over 400 hours between overhauls. Carrier maintenance crews could turn around aircraft quickly, meaning more planes were available for combat missions. One squadron recorded 92% aircraft availability rate over a 3-month deployment period. The production investigation revealed American industrial dominance. Grumman's Bethpage factory operated 3 shifts, 24 hours daily, producing Hellcats at an ever-increasing rate. By mid-1944, monthly production exceeded 500 aircraft. Parts were completely interchangeable, meaning any Hellcat could accept components from any other. This standardization simplified logistics and maintenance enormously. The strategic consequence was Admiral Raymond Spruance's decision to accelerate Operation Forager, the invasion of the Mariana Islands. Confident that Hellcat-equipped carrier groups could achieve air superiority anywhere, he moved the timetable forward. Task Force 58, with 15 carriers and 475 Hellcats, sortied for the Marianas in June 1944. The Japanese response to the Hellcats' dominance was too little, too late. They attempted to develop improved fighters like the Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, but production problems and resource shortages meant few reached operational units. They tried to improve Zero performance with the A6M5 variant, but the fundamental design limitations remained. They even attempted to train pilots in tactics specifically designed to counter the Hellcat. But undertrained pilots couldn't execute complex maneuvers under combat stress. By June 1944, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of its former strength. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet could muster only 430 aircraft, and most pilots were inexperienced replacements. Against this weakened force, Admiral Mark Mitchell's Task Force 58 carried 956 aircraft, half of them F6F Hellcats, flown by highly trained, confident pilots. The investigation's final conclusion was unambiguous. The F6F Hellcat had achieved complete air superiority in the Pacific. The consequence would be demonstrated in the most one-sided carrier battle in history. 2 distinct combat philosophies developed among Hellcat pilots, and the debate between them shaped tactics throughout the war. The division wasn't about basic principles. Everyone agreed the Hellcat's advantages were speed, firepower, and durability. The debate was about how to exploit those advantages most effectively against Japanese fighters. The dogfighting approach was championed by pilots who'd cut their teeth in wildcats, where turning fights were sometimes unavoidable. They argued that the Hellcat's powerful engine and strong airframe meant it could compete in turning engagements better than previous American fighters. While the Zero could still outturn a Hellcat, the F6F's speed and acceleration meant pilots could disengage at will. Proponents advocated engaging Zeros in sustained combat, using altitude advantage and energy management to gradually wear down Japanese formations. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, the Navy's first ace, briefly advocated modified dogfighting tactics before his death in November 1943. He developed techniques for using the Wildcats' limited advantages against Zeros and believed similar methods would work even better with the Hellcats' improved performance. His squadron practiced extended engagements where Hellcats would use climbing and diving spirals to position for gun runs while avoiding the Zero's tightest turning radius. The boom and zoom approach became dominant among most Hellcat squadrons. Commander John Thatch, architect of the famous Thatch-Weave defensive tactic, advocated aggressive, high-speed attacks from superior altitude. Hellcats would climb above enemy formations, dive at high speed, fire a burst, then use momentum to climb back to altitude. The Zero couldn't follow in a high-speed dive or climb, leaving them vulnerable to repeated attacks. This high-speed tactic exploited the Hellcats' most significant advantages. The F6F could dive faster without compressibility problems that plagued some fighters. The rugged airframe could handle high G pullouts that would damage lighter aircraft. The powerful engine could regain altitude quickly after diving attacks. Most importantly, the 6 guns delivered devastating firepower during brief, high-speed passes. Commander David McCampbell perfected the boom and zoom technique to an art form. He positioned VF-15 at 25,000 feet or higher before combat, waited for radar controllers to vector him to enemy formations below, then led coordinated diving attacks where entire squadrons would strike simultaneously. The Japanese formations would be shattered in seconds. Individual survivors picked off as they tried to escape. The formation debate was equally important. Traditional naval fighter tactics emphasized tight formations where aircraft supported each other. Some commanders wanted Hellcat divisions to maintain close spacing for mutual defense. Others advocated loose formations where aircraft had more freedom to maneuver independently. The loose formation philosophy won out because it better suited the Hellcat's characteristics. Unlike the fragile Wildcat, which needed wingman support to survive, the Hellcat was tough enough to operate semi-independently. Pilots spread out several hundred yards apart could cover more sky, detect enemies earlier, and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. The Japanese tactic of concentrating multiple Zeros on a single target became less effective when Hellcats operated in loose formations. The altitude advantage theory was universal among Hellcat pilots. Everyone agreed that starting combat at higher altitude than the enemy was essential. The question was, how much higher? Some advocated modest advantages of 3,000 to 5,000 feet. Enough to dive for gun runs, but close enough to prevent enemy escape. Others pushed for extreme altitude advantages of 10,000 feet or more, accepting that some enemies might escape in exchange for complete tactical control. Commander Paul Bowie of VF-16 developed the theory of overwhelming firepower concentration. He trained his pilots to hold fire until within 300 yards, then deliver maximum burst. Instead of long-range harassing fire, VF-16 pilots closed to knife-fighting distance and destroyed enemies with 2-second bursts. The tactic required discipline and precision, but resulted in extremely high kill ratios. The night-fighting theory emerged when some squadrons began equipping Hellcats with radar for intercepting Japanese night bombers. The debate was whether night fighters should be specialized aircraft or whether all Hellcat pilots should receive night training. The compromise was specialized night fighter detachments within regular squadrons, allowing tactical flexibility. By mid-1944, a consensus emerged, combining elements from all theories. Hellcat pilots would maintain altitude advantage, operate in loose formations, allowing tactical flexibility, use high-speed diving attacks as primary tactic, and concentrate overwhelming firepower in brief engagements. Dogfighting was avoided unless absolutely necessary. The Zero's maneuverability advantage was negated by refusing to fight on Japanese terms. The strategy's effectiveness would be proven beyond any doubt over the Philippine Sea. In June 1944, when 475 Hellcats would destroy nearly 500 Japanese aircraft in the most one-sided air battle in history. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, on June 19th and 20th, 1944, was the turning point that revealed the true extent of Japanese naval aviation's collapse. What appeared to be a one-sided American victory was actually something more profound. Was the death of an entire military arm, the final destruction of the carrier force that had dominated the Pacific for 2 years. With superior aircraft, better trained pilots, radar direction, and overwhelming numbers, American victory was inevitable. The mystery was why Japanese commanders committed their remaining carrier air groups to battle when defeat was certain. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa had to know his pilots were undertrained and his forces outmatched, yet he still launched Operation Ago, Japan's last chance for the decisive carrier battle they'd sought since Midway. The deeper truth was that Japan had no choice. American forces were invading Saipan, the Marianas Key Island. If Saipan fell, American B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The consequences would be catastrophic. Japanese strategic doctrine had always emphasized the decisive battle, where inferior forces would win through superior spirit and tactical skill. Ozawa believed that combining carrier aircraft with land-based planes from Guam, plus the Zero's longer range allowing shuttle attacks, might create the conditions for victory. He was wrong. The land-based aircraft from Guam had been destroyed in preliminary strikes. The Zero's longer range was negated by radar warning that gave Hellcats time to intercept at altitude. The shuttle attack strategy failed because American submarines and surface forces blocked the approach routes. But Ozawa launched his strikes anyway because doing nothing meant certain defeat. Attacking offered at least a chance of disrupting American operations. The first strike wave, launched at 8:30 on June 19th, consisted of 69 aircraft. Radar detected them at 150 miles range. Fighter directors began vectoring Hellcats to intercept positions. By the time Japanese formations reached the task force, they faced over 200 Hellcats positioned perfectly at altitude. Slaughter began immediately. Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15, spotted the first raid approaching at 18,000 feet. His formation was at 25,000 feet, perfectly positioned. He later wrote in his action report that the Japanese maintained parade formation, flying straight and level. His pilots couldn't believe enemy aircraft would expose themselves so completely. They dove, fired, and climbed back to altitude. 37 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the first engagement. The pattern repeated through 4 Japanese strike waves. Each time, radar detected the formations far from the fleet. Fighter directors positioned Hellcats for ideal attacks. Japanese pilots, many with less than 100 hours training, maintained formation discipline but couldn't react effectively to coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Hellcat pilots, with hundreds of training hours and months of combat experience, executed perfectly. I personally shot down 7 aircraft that day, 5 duty dive bombers in the morning, then 2 zeros over Guam in the afternoon. My wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 4. Between us, we'd eliminated 11 enemy aircraft, more than many squadrons achieved in entire battles early in the war. We weren't exceptional. Dozens of Hellcat pilots achieved multiple kills that day because the combat was so one-sided. The turning point came not during combat, but in the hours afterward when Japanese survivors straggled back to their carriers. Of 373 aircraft launched in 4 strike waves, only 130 returned. Over 240 aircraft lost, most shot down by Hellcats. The pilots who did return reported that American fighters were everywhere, that the Hellcat was faster and more heavily armed than expected, that Japanese formations were torn apart before reaching targets. Admiral Ozawa realized then that Japanese carrier aviation was finished. Demoralized and depleted, that continuing operations would simply complete their destruction. The decisive battle had been fought, and Japan had lost catastrophically. The Hellcat had proven so dominant that the fundamental balance of Pacific air power had shifted permanently. The deeper mystery was why this happened so suddenly. 2 years earlier, Japanese pilots in Zeros had been the Pacific's most feared warriors. The truth was that America's industrial and training advantages had finally reached critical mass. We could build fighters faster than they could be destroyed, train pilots faster than they could be killed, and improve tactics faster than the enemy could adapt. The Hellcat was the weapon that delivered that advantage with devastating finality. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot's implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. The battle demonstrated that American naval aviation had achieved such overwhelming superiority that Japanese forces could no longer contest control of Pacific airspace. This strategic reality would shape the war's final year and influence post-war carrier aviation development for decades. The immediate implication was operational freedom. Task Force 58 could operate anywhere in the Pacific without fear of effective Japanese air attack. Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet could support amphibious operations at Saipan and eventually Iwo Jima and Okinawa with confidence that Hellcat-equipped carriers would maintain air superiority. The Japanese carrier force, which had dominated the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Midway, was finished as an effective fighting force. The technological implication was profound. The Hellcat proved that heavily armored fighters could dominate lighter, more maneuverable opponents. This reversed decades of fighter design philosophy. Before the war, most air forces emphasized agility and performance over protection and firepower. The Hellcat demonstrated that pilot survivability and overwhelming offensive capability produced better combat results than pure aerodynamic performance. This lesson influenced American fighter development through the jet age. The F6F Bearcat, developed as the Hellcat's successor, retained the emphasis on pilot protection and heavy armament. Post-war fighters, like the F9F Panther and F4U Corsair, followed similar design philosophy. Even modern fighters prioritize survivability and weapon systems over pure maneuverability. The Hellcat established design principles that remain relevant today. The training implication was equally significant. The Turkey Shoot proved that systematic pilot training produced more consistent results than individual brilliance. American pilots with 300 to 400 hours training regularly defeated Japanese pilots with thousands of hours experience because American training emphasized practical combat skills, while Japanese training focused on aerobatics and formation flying. Quality training mattered more than quantity. The industrial implication shaped post-war American military thinking. The Hellcat demonstrated that industrial capacity could overcome initial technological Disadvantages. Japan's Zero was superior to early American fighters, but America's ability to design, produce, and deploy the Hellcat in massive quantities reversed that advantage decisively. Victory went to the nation that could innovate and produce faster, not the nation with the best initial equipment. The tactical implication revolutionized carrier operations. Before the Hellcat, carriers were vulnerable to air attack and had to operate cautiously. With F6F fighters providing impenetrable defense, carriers became offensive platforms that could strike deep into enemy territory with impunity. The carrier task force evolved from a defensive formation, protecting valuable ships, into an offensive weapon that projected power across thousands of miles. The psychological implication was devastating for Japanese morale. Pilots who survived encounters with Hellcats spread word that the new American fighter was invincible. Japanese aircrew began viewing missions as suicide runs before the formal adoption of kamikaze tactics. The Hellcat hadn't just defeated them physically, it had broken their spirit psychologically. Many Japanese pilots showed symptoms of combat fatigue and refused to engage when they spotted Hellcats. The strategic implication forced Japan to abandon carrier aviation entirely. After the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese carriers rarely operated because they had no trained pilots to fly from them. The remaining carriers were eventually converted to decoys or used for suicide missions. The carrier force that struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific for 2 years ceased to exist as a viable fighting force. The Hellcat had rendered an entire strategic capability obsolete. The doctrine implication influenced how the Navy integrated fighters with carrier operations. The F6F proved that fighter direction from radar-equipped carriers could coordinate complex defensive operations. This led to development of the Combat Information Center concept, where dedicated controllers managed air battles. Modern carrier operations still use descendants of these systems developed to maximize Hellcat effectiveness. Perhaps the most profound implication was proving that American innovation and industrial might could defeat any opponent. The Hellcat represented everything America did well: practical engineering, mass production, systematic training, and tactical flexibility. Japan's warrior culture and decades of military tradition couldn't overcome those advantages. In modern warfare, technology and industry defeated courage and spirit. The F6F Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio wasn't just a statistic. It was proof that America's approach to war, industrial mobilization combined with technological innovation and systematic training, was superior to any alternative. That lesson shaped American military thinking throughout the Cold War and remains relevant today. Flying the F6F Hellcat changed how American carrier pilots thought about combat and their chances of survival. For the first time, we flew a fighter that protected us adequately while giving us overwhelming advantages against enemy aircraft. That psychological shift affected everything from tactical decisions to personal confidence. In the Wildcat, every combat mission carried the knowledge that your aircraft was inferior to the enemy's. You fought at a disadvantage and survived through skill, luck, and sheer determination. The stress was enormous. Pilots developed stress-related illnesses, had nightmares, and showed symptoms of combat fatigue after relatively few missions. The casualty rate was high enough that most pilots didn't expect to survive their deployment. The Hellcat changed that calculation. We still faced danger, but we flew aircraft that gave us excellent chances of surviving and winning. The armor protected us from wounds that would have been fatal in lighter fighters. The self-sealing fuel tanks meant that hits didn't automatically result in catastrophic fires. The powerful engine could bring us home even with significant battle damage. That protection reduced stress dramatically. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrasiu, one of the Navy's top aces, described the psychological difference. He said that in the Wildcat, you were always worried about getting hit because you knew you were flying a fragile aircraft. In the Hellcat, you could focus on fighting because you knew the aircraft would protect you. That confidence made you more aggressive, more willing to take calculated risks, more effective in combat. The camaraderie among Hellcat pilots was intense, but different from earlier fighter squadrons. We didn't have the desperate, fatalistic bonding of men who expected to die. Confidence of pilots who believed we'd survive and win. We celebrated victories, planned for the future, and talked about what we'd do after the war. That optimism affected morale enormously. The Japanese pilots experienced the opposite psychological effect. They knew they flew inferior aircraft with inadequate training against a superior enemy. Every mission was potentially fatal. The stress on Japanese aircrew was catastrophic. Pilots who survived multiple missions showed extreme combat fatigue. Many requested ground duty rather than continue flying. Some committed suicide rather than fly additional missions. The human cost on the Japanese side was devastating. In the 6 months before the Philippine Sea battle, Japanese naval aviation lost over 800 pilots, killed or missing. These weren't just numbers. They were experienced airmen who'd trained for years, men with families and futures. The waste was terrible, and the surviving pilots knew they were next. American pilots understood what we were doing to them. There was satisfaction in achieving victory, but also recognition that we were killing men who might have been friends under different circumstances. The intensity of combat left little room for reflection during missions, but afterward, in ready rooms and squadron quarters, we talked about what we'd done and what it meant. The physical conditions of carrier life affected everyone. Ready rooms where pilots waited for launch orders became almost like living rooms. We played cards, wrote letters, studied aircraft recognition, and tried not to think about the next mission. The tension before combat was always present. No matter how confident we felt about the Hellcats' capabilities, the maintenance crews who kept our Hellcats flying deserved enormous credit. They worked in impossible conditions, often in tropical heat or during rough seas, maintaining complex aircraft with limited tools and parts. Every pilot knew his life depended on mechanics who checked engines, armored guns, and repaired battle damage. The bond between pilots and ground crews was absolute. The cost of victory was measured in exhaustion. Carrier operations ran continuously for months. Pilots flew multiple missions daily, often launching at dawn and not returning until after dark. The physical and mental fatigue accumulated. By the end of long deployments, even successful squadrons showed strain. Men became short-tempered, made minor mistakes, and needed rest that rarely came. But we endured because we knew we were winning. The Hellcat gave us that certainty. We could see the evidence in kill ratios, in damaged Japanese aircraft fleeing, in the decreasing quality of enemy opposition. We were part of something historic, the complete destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The humanity of carrier warfare came down to simple truths. We were young men, far from home, fighting a war we didn't start, flying the best fighter aircraft in the world, and winning decisively. The pride in that achievement sustained us through fear, exhaustion, and loss. The truth about the F6F Hellcat, the truth that took years to fully understand, is that it wasn't just a better fighter aircraft. It was the physical embodiment of American industrial supremacy, technological innovation, and systematic training, reaching critical mass simultaneously. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio represented something deeper than tactical superiority. It represented the complete dominance of American military capability over Japanese forces. The revelation came gradually during post-war analysis when researchers examined Japanese records and interviewed surviving enemy pilots. What Americans assumed was overwhelming Hellcat superiority was actually the collapse of Japanese naval aviation across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The aircraft, the pilots, the tactics, the logistics, everything was failing at once. Japanese aircraft production was in crisis by 1944. Factories lacked raw materials, especially aluminum and high-grade steel. Engine manufacturers couldn't maintain quality control with experienced workers drafted into military service. The Zero's declining quality meant that even new aircraft off the production line had performance problems. Engines didn't develop rated power. Control surfaces were poorly aligned. Fuel systems leaked. American pilots were fighting not just an inferior design, but increasingly defective examples of that design. The fuel situation was catastrophic. Japan's access to petroleum had been cut by American submarines and long-range bombers. Refineries couldn't produce high-octane aviation fuel in sufficient quantities. By 1944, Japanese aircraft were running on 87-octane fuel that reduced engine power significantly. Some pilots reported their engines would barely develop 70% of rated power. Meanwhile, American Hellcats ran on 100-octane fuel that allowed full combat power without mechanical stress. The pilot training collapse was perhaps most significant. Japan had started the war with the world's best-trained carrier pilots, men with over 1,000 hours flight time and years of tactical training. By mid-1944, those veterans were dead. Replacements received minimal training because Japan lacked fuel for training flights, spare aircraft for practice, and experienced instructors to teach proper techniques. Some pilots reached combat units with less than 50 hours total flight time and had never fired their guns in training. The tactical revelation was that Japanese naval aviation had never developed effective responses to American innovations. They understood radar existed but couldn't effectively counter radar-directed fighter intercepts. They recognized American aircraft were improving but couldn't match the pace of innovation. They knew their pilot quality was declining but lacked resources to improve training. Every American advantage compounded Japanese disadvantages. The strategic revelation was most profound. The Hellcat alone didn't defeat Japanese naval aviation. Rather, the Hellcat was the weapon that delivered accumulated American advantages. Industrial production that could replace losses indefinitely. Training programs that produced skilled pilots systematically. Tactical innovation that developed new doctrines rapidly. And technological development that continuously improved capabilities. Japan couldn't match any of these advantages, much less all of them simultaneously. The personal revelation, what I came to understand over decades of reflection, was that we weren't heroes in the traditional sense. We were competent pilots, flying superior aircraft against an enemy that was collapsing under the weight of industrial and strategic disadvantages they couldn't overcome. Our victories were inevitable once American industrial mobilization reached full strength. The courage and skill were real, but the outcome was predetermined by factors far beyond individual combat. The uncomfortable revelation was recognizing how many Japanese pilots died unnecessarily because their commanders wouldn't acknowledge defeat. The Battle of the Philippine Sea should never have been fought. Japanese forces had no realistic chance of victory. Launching those attacks was sending men to certain death for no strategic gain. Over 600 Japanese aircrew died, achieving nothing except delaying inevitable defeat by a few weeks. The final revelation was understanding that the Hellcat's legacy extended beyond its combat record. The F6F proved that modern warfare was won by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and systematic training. Individual courage and warrior spirit, which Japanese military culture emphasized, weren't enough to overcome material disadvantages. This lesson shaped American military thinking throughout the Cold War and remains relevant today. The F6F Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over Japanese militarism. We built better aircraft, trained better pilots, developed better tactics, and sustained operations longer. The Hellcat delivered those advantages with devastating efficiency, crushing Japanese naval aviation so completely that they never recovered. That's the truth, both glorious and sobering, of the fighter that ended the age of the Zero. I'm writing this in the spring of 2008, 64 years after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The F6F Hellcat I flew in 1944 sits in the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, restored to pristine condition. Thousands of visitors see it every year, and I wonder if they understand what that dark blue fighter represents. It's not just an aircraft. It's evidence of how American innovation, industrial might, and determination changed history. Of the pilots who flew with Air Group 15 that day in June 1944, few remain alive. We're old men now, in our 80s and 90s, but when we gather for reunions, we still talk about the Hellcat with affection and respect. That aircraft saved our lives more times than we can count and gave us confidence to fight aggressively when others might have been cautious. People ask me what I want them to remember about the F6F and the men who flew it. I tell them to remember that the Hellcat represented everything America did well during World War II. We faced an enemy with better initial equipment and more experience. Instead of accepting defeat, we innovated, producing a fighter specifically designed to defeat the Zero. We manufactured that fighter in quantities the enemy couldn't match. We trained pilots systematically to use it effectively. And we developed tactics that exploited its advantages ruthlessly. Remember that the Hellcat wasn't invincible. Pilots died flying F6Fs. Aircraft were shot down. We lost friends and squadron mates. But the Hellcat gave us better chances of survival and victory than any previous carrier fighter. That difference between barely adequate and genuinely superior equipment determined who won the Pacific Air War. Remember also the men on both sides. Japanese pilots weren't cowards or incompetents. They were brave men, flying inferior aircraft with inadequate training against overwhelming opposition. They fought courageously despite knowing they couldn't win. That courage deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge their cause was wrong and their defeat was necessary. The legacy of the F6F Hellcat lives in every modern carrier fighter. The emphasis on pilot protection, heavy firepower, and robust construction that characterize the Hellcat remains standard in aircraft design. The integration of fighters with radar-directed control systems developed for Hellcat operations forms the basis of modern carrier air defense. The systematic training programs that produced skilled Hellcat pilots evolved into today's naval aviation training pipeline. Most importantly, the Hellcat proved that American industrial democracy could defeat any totalitarian system. Japan's military culture emphasized warrior spirit and individual sacrifice. America's industrial culture emphasized practical engineering, mass production, and systematic efficiency. In the crucible of combat, the American approach proved superior. The Hellcat delivered that victory with a 19-to-1 kill ratio that still stands as the most successful fighter aircraft performance in history. As I finish this account, I can still remember the feeling of strapping into a Hellcat before dawn. The smell of aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, the throaty roar of that magnificent R-2800 engine starting up. I remember the tension before combat, the adrenaline during engagements, the relief after landing safely. Most of all, I remember the confidence of knowing I flew the best fighter in the world. The Japanese were stunned by America's F6F Hellcat because it represented capabilities they couldn't match and innovations they didn't expect. They'd prepared to fight the war they knew against the aircraft we had in 1942. They weren't prepared for the war we created, where American industrial might produce superior aircraft faster than they could be destroyed and trained pilots faster than they could be killed. The F6F Hellcat crushed the Zero not just through tactical superiority, but by embodying American industrial and technological dominance. Every Hellcat victory represented American factories, American training programs, American innovation, and American determination to win regardless of cost or effort required. We were young men flying blue fighters with white stars, fighting to protect our nation and free the world from tyranny. We succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, achieving kill ratios and operational success that seemed impossible before the war. We did it in aircraft that gave us the tools to win and brought us home safely afterward. The age of the Zero ended when the Hellcat arrived. American air supremacy began over the Philippine Sea in June 1944 and never wavered until Japan surrendered 15 months later. The F6F Hellcat was the weapon that delivered that supremacy. That legacy of American innovation overcoming any obstacle remains the Hellcat's greatest contribution to victory.